Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Trump administration has released its latest unified agenda, offering the clearest picture yet of what federal agencies expect to work on in the coming months. While the White House continues to emphasize deregulation, the agenda shows a government that remains deeply engaged in writing and revising rules. Joining me for a closer look, Will Yeatman, the new director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Will, thanks so much for joining me. Welcome to the Federal Drive.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
You've just taken over the Regulatory Studies Center at the George Washington University. As you step into that job, what are the questions about regulation and governance that you're most interested in helping policymakers answer?
Oh, my. I think it's the regulatory instability that pervades our current system. And by this, I mean most domestic policy is now emanating from the executive branch rather than the legislative branch. About 3,000 to 4,000 law-like rules annually, generally more if there's a Democratic administration and less if there's a Republican administration, of which roughly 50 to 100 annually on average are economically significant, meaning they entail regulatory costs of greater than $100 million. So what we've got here is this situation whereby because all this policy is executive branch driven, every 4 to 8 years, whenever there's a political changeover in the Oval Office, the machinery of government stops on a dime and pivots 180 degrees. And it's been this way, and increasingly so, only in the last 30-odd years. And this is no way to run a government. There's no way to run the greatest country on earth. And I think it's the rare regulatory talking point that resonates with anyone. I mean, I think on its face, it makes no sense.
That's a really important overarching decision that we are moving away from stability and moving to a world where policy swings as the administration's priorities and maybe even parties change. The Trump administration has just put out its Spring 25 unified agenda, which is its capturing of all of the regulatory actions that it's planning to undertake for the coming year. Your center's analysis found, as you said, almost 4,000 actions in this document. What's the biggest headline that listeners should take away from this?
Oh, geez. The biggest headline is that they're busy. This unified agenda, 2026 unified agenda, it contained 400 more active actions than there were in last year's unified agenda, regulatory actions. These are numbers commensurate with the spring agenda from President Biden's final year in office. And what we're seeing here is actually a new normal with respect to when administrations feel as though they've got to get rules out the door. So for decades, it's been the case that the key period by which administrations wanted to get their regulations completed was about 7 to 8 months before their final term, before their final year in office. This pertains to this mechanism in Congress known as the Congressional Review Act that allows a Congress to veto an executive branch measure. Setting that aside, the important point is, whereas for decades, this was the key 6-7 months out from your final year when it ended, that was the key to get all your rules out the door. With this administration, we're seeing something new, and it's a rush to get their regulations out the door, not in order to meet this Congressional Review Act, stave off that threat, but instead to control judicial review all the way through the close of the case, through the defense of the rule in question. The fear being that if a different administration were to, if you lose an election and you change over control of the White House and therefore the political direction of the Justice Department, that you couldn't, that in essence, a subsequent administration's Justice Department would pull their punches or refuse to defend a policy with which they disagree. So I think that's the top line takeaway is they're very busy. They're actually going to enter what is their busiest period of this second term, I would guess. And the reason for that is this new normal, whereby instead of trying to protect your regulations from being overturned by a subsequent administration by getting them out the door 6-7 months out from when your administration ends. The new normal, really starting with this administration, is getting all your regs done 2 years out and giving you 2 years during which time your Justice Department, your administration can shepherd, can steward the defense of these rules in court.
That's a fascinating observation. And it requires an administration to really have done its homework before it takes office the first day. How are you seeing that timeline change preparation for a regulatory agenda?
Oh, wow. I would say, with respect, this second administration has definitely been far more prepared than the first. I'd venture a guess that they didn't expect to win the first term, the Trump administration. And as such, they didn't participate in a traditional transition process from the Obama administration to the first Trump administration. Long-winded way of saying the first administration didn't have its act together on day one. They didn't have a management team in place, and that showed. It took them roughly 2 years to get their leadership team in place. The second administration was way different. Second administration, it was a mystery because they, again, didn't participate in the transition process, but they had a very well-orchestrated plan, and quite frankly, we're seeing that in terms of the difference between the strategic ends and, indeed, the means from the first administration to the second administration.
Will Yeatman is the new director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper then, because the Trump administration came in really touting a deregulatory agenda. And yet, as you've articulated, they're writing as many regulations, if not more, than the administrations that preceded them. How should people perceive that? Do you have to write regulation in order to deregulate, or are they adding to the regulatory pile?
It is, well, first, to answer to your last question, do they have to write regulations to deregulate? Yes. And that actually gets to this broader point that lends crucial context to your question, which is these thousands of active actions, this very busy period, these numbers that we've been bandying about regarding the 2026 Unified Agenda, they include both regulatory and deregulatory actions. And indeed, my colleague at the Regulatory Studies Center, Finn Dobkin, performed an independent analysis of the regulatory or deregulatory status of 173 active economically significant rules. So that is, he took the subset of rules that cost more than $100 million that are active, and he looked at the breakdown of regulatory to deregulatory, and he found it was about 2-to-1 deregulatory to regulatory. So despite the big numbers, despite the big top-line numbers in the Unified Agenda, looking under the numbers, it is indicative of, indeed, yes, a very robust deregulatory effort, and one that, again, was going to kick up in earnest, very much so, over the next 6 months to beat this new normal deadline of 2 years out.
So when you think about those economically significant rules, rather than just the big raw numbers, in addition to a 2-to-1 deregulatory versus regulatory ratio, what else do you see in there? Are there priorities or agencies or types of rules or signals that indicate where this administration wants to leave its regulatory mark?
This is interesting. So, frankly, no. So last year's 2025 Unified Agenda by the Trump administration was rife with analysis and all sorts of claims and all sorts of bragging about their deregulatory agenda. I mean, it was just there was a great deal of analysis to that end. It was clearly this focus. It's much more cursory, or at least the qualitative narrative to this 2026 Unified Agenda with respect to deregulation. There's virtually no analysis whatsoever. Now, to be sure, in the about a page and a half preamble, they do set forth their deregulatory aims. They frame it within the celebration of the 250th American anniversary, the Declaration of Independence and whatnot. But I found this very interesting. I and other regulatory analysts found it quite telling, or not telling, but interesting, that there was this disparity, that last year it was clearly front line and center, and they spent a great deal of effort on this deregulatory narrative. This year, not so much. To be sure, there could be a discrepancy between words and actions. And again, I reiterate what I said before. Despite the lack of deregulatory narrative, their entering full throttle into the busiest deregulatory period of the second Trump administration.
So for federal managers and agency leaders and maybe contractors and Congress who are looking at this, what lessons should they take here about where this administration is headed from a regulatory perspective and how serious it's going to be going forward about even increasing the work it's currently laid out on the table?
Oh, my. Well, I'll say this. The unified agenda, one of its virtues is the specificity with which it reports this survey of federal regulatory actions. So to the extent any member of the public, regulated community, or policymaker is curious about any agency's direction, and very specific over the next 12-odd months, this document would provide those answers. Regarding the Trump administration's, what is the future to tell? Again, I think right now we're going to enter a very, very busy period of administrative policymaking, and I expect that to continue through the second year of the Trump term. And then, quite frankly, given this new normal, given how all the priority regulations are going to be front-loaded in the first 2 years, I expect years 3 and 4 to entail a lot more far-reaching, perhaps tenuous efforts that perhaps are more directed towards politically pleasing elements of the base.
Will Yeatman is the new director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Will, thanks so much for joining me, and good luck as you begin this important tenure.
Thank you so much, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.